Hey, thanks for joining the Young Widow podcast today for our first episode. Let's get started. I'm Brittany, the host of the podcast, and I really just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for being here. Whether your time on this podcast is short and you only listen to a portion of an episode, or you become an avid follower, I'm happy that you found my podcast. I thought a lot about what I would say today on the introduction, and really I just want to cover the intent of the podcast, what you can expect to get from it, who I am, and what gives me the credentials to run a podcast for young widows, and then just convey my passion for helping others along their grief journey and finding growth through post-traumatic growth tools. So, who am I and how do I have the credentials to run a podcast for young widows? A little about myself. I was widowed at the age of 31 overnight, had no idea that I was going to wake up and be a widow. I quickly found myself living the horrific experience of deep grief. And if you lived through deep grief, you know what I'm talking about when I bluntly put it as the horrific experience. Overnight, I became the solo parent to a daughter, the sole financial provider for my family, and the sole decision maker. All while trying to figure out how to traverse grief and losing the person who was supposed to be with me for the rest of my life. It's now been over 4 years into my grief journey. I am not fully healed. You'll never fully heal from grief. But over the course of the 4 years, I have progressed from active grieving into my post-traumatic growth phase, and I help coach other widows, specifically young widows, in how to traverse obstacles within their grief journey. I want to talk a little bit about how I ended up here and how I went from being a widow one day to 4 years later coaching other widows. So, taking it back to my early days of grief, when I first lost my husband, I used to lay in bed crying, scouring the internet looking for blogs, journal writings, postings from other widows, and I wanted to read their raw emotion. Why? Because I wanted validation and assimilation of my emotions in that moment. I wanted to know that the way I was feeling was how I was supposed to be feeling, that somebody else had been through this and was traversing the worst moment of their life. And like, this is what it was supposed to feel like. I wanted to know that it was supposed to feel this bad. And I really struggled with that. I really struggled with finding somebody that would talk about the raw emotion. I didn't want an opinion from a therapist. I didn't want an opinion from somebody that just wanted to coach me through it. I wanted somebody to tell me, yes, you are supposed to feel like your whole world is falling apart. And I couldn't find it. Weeks later, a couple months later, one of my friends introduced me to a program in which I was given a grief mentor. And that grief mentor was a widow. And she was a young widow. And she had become a solo parent. And that person guided me through my grief. Out of everybody in my life, family, friends, people that had an emotional connection to me, this woman that I had never met, who was a voice on the other end of the phone, was the person that pulled me through grief, was the person that made me feel heard. She was the person that witnessed my grief without judging, without saying dumb things, and making me feel like my feelings were validated. Going through that with her really opened up my view, and it really made me feel like there are a lot of people that probably want the same thing that I wanted. So I eventually wrote a book. I wrote a book focusing on the early stages of grief and helping widows understand that what they're feeling in the moment that is happening related to a specific event is how they're supposed to be feeling. After writing that book, I started leaning into coaching. And from that, launched this podcast in order to tie it all together, have a wider reach, and really just put grief information out there in the raw for other people to hear. I think it's important for me to cover the audience of my podcast. I am a young widow. I do focus on coaching young widows through their grief, whether it's active grieving or their post-traumatic growth stage. However, I want to say that my podcast is really for anybody grieving. You could have lost a mother, father, brother, sister, close friend, aunt, uncle, somebody in your life, even if you're a longtime partner because you weren't married, and you could be grieving. And my podcast is meant for you. I think it is important for me to scope the angle at which I am talking from. I have never experienced deep grief aside from the loss of my husband. I haven't lost either of my parents. I haven't lost a child. And I've lost some friends, but not my very close friend. And so Throughout this podcast, when I am talking about grief, you're going to hear me reference widowhood. You're going to hear me reference my husband, and I'm going to really be referencing it from the angle of widowhood. But if you take a step back, I think it's important to say that we can all learn from each other's grief. Just because you are not a widow does not mean that you can't follow my podcast. I've talked about this before in my coaching and online. We all traverse similar grief journeys. Nobody's grief journey is the same. It can't be the same because we're not the same people and we didn't live an identical life. So we all experience a similar journey in grief. We all have triggers. We all experience similar emotion. And then we eventually experience a similar path into healing. Now, the time frame of those journeys could be significantly different based on who you lost, but the grief journeys are all similar in nature. So really, if you're listening to this podcast and you've experienced grief, or maybe you're listening to this podcast because somebody in your life has experienced deep grief and you want to understand how to confront situations or obstacles they're dealing with, then this podcast was meant for you. So I would ask that you just don't pay attention necessarily to the label of widowhood. It is a grief podcast. It's meant to help people through their grief journey. But my niche in coaching and post-traumatic growth is specific to widows. And I just want to put that out there before getting started. I want to cover a little bit about what you can expect to get from this podcast and what you can expect not to get from this podcast. So it is a grief podcast. I am going to focus on widowhood, but there are some things that I'm not going to do. So if you don't know me, I'm a very animated speaker. I tend to move around a lot. So apologies for that ahead of time. But there are some things about me that are very nuanced compared to other coaches. I am going to give you the raw emotions and the raw perspective of grief. I am not going to sugarcoat it. I think we do a disservice to people that are looking for guidance, that are looking to explore different obstacles by sugarcoating it and just guiding them through it and giving them the answer. That is not what I'm going to do. This podcast is about giving you a perspective. I can't give you the answer to grief. I can't give you the answer key because there isn't, because I've never been in your situation and my situation is different. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You are going to get the raw emotions, and I cannot give you an answer key if that's what you're looking for. Unfortunately, it's not going to be on this podcast. A couple other things that you're not going to get from this podcast, which I've seen is different than some coaches. I think it's important to say, I'm not going to victimize you in your grief. I'm not going to sit here and validate you victimizing yourself in your grief and making decisions that are negatively affecting your life and using your grief as an excuse for that. Now, there is a difference in victimizing yourself in grief compared from active grieving and post-traumatic growth, which is an episode that we will get into later. But I just want to open up with saying that if you're looking for somebody to tell you everything that you're doing is okay and you don't need to change anything, that is not me. That is not who I am as a coach. And that's not going to be something that you are going to get out of this. I'm also not going to tell you that everything's going to be okay. I'm not going to tell you that time's going to heal your wounds, that if you just give it time, your grief's going to pass, because that's not reality. You need to learn to coexist with your grief. You need to learn to live in duality. And duality is finding happiness in moments of sadness. So I'm not going to do that. I think that when people did that in my early stages of grief, it really put me off because I didn't feel like time would heal all wounds. And now years later, I know that it doesn't. But there are some things that you can get out of this podcast. I'm going to talk about the different emotions in grief. I'm going to talk about different obstacles that I traversed in grief. I'm going to use perspective of other young widows that I have worked with. And then I'm also going to bring on guest speakers to this podcast to give you a perspective from other angles of grief. Maybe somebody that lost a child or somebody that lost a parent. And then we will kind of converse and show you the difference in the same obstacle when dealing with different types of losses. There are no rules to grieving, and I'm solely here to give you an unfiltered perspective of what I went through in grief, and then to sit with you in a common place of understanding and help you traverse and work through obstacles in your own grief. So if everything I've discussed on this podcast sounds what you're looking for, then I'm happy you found the Young Widow podcast. I hope you tune in. We'll be talking about the difference between active grieving and post-traumatic growth, how you identify which phase in grief you're in, and then how you take the active steps to move into the next phase in your grief journey. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.